Good afternoon, folks. I am going to be talking a little bit about urban GIS applications, and I wanted to point out that this is certainly a subset. GIS is a huge part of the urban landscape and an emerging role in which many things we don't really know what the applications will be in the years to come, but we're going to take a look at a few examples. So on my list here, you can see past, present, and future conditions, transportation planning, and this includes pedestrians, cyclists, mass transit of all varieties, bus, train, light rail, and automobile, recreation resources, emergency response, an important role, resource allocation for social services. We'll look at some community engagement, including VGI applications, hazard mitigation, demographic mapping, which is basically your population mapping, public asset management, and planning for future development and enhancing livability. So let's launch into looking at a few of our specific examples here. Okay, so we're going to be using San Francisco as a city of focus, one that many of us are probably familiar with, and certainly a robust GIS community in the city and lots of interesting applications. So this particular map is just a base map that I created, and in this map you can see a view of the city maybe that people don't see on a lot of the maps they look at, which is focused on topography. Of course, cities famously the hills of San Francisco, and you see some of them marked here: Telegraph Hill, Nob Hill, some of the mountainous interior of the San Francisco Peninsula. Past, present, and future conditions. This is actually a I'm going to have to end my show to show you the map that I wanted you to see here, because there are actually two versions of this particular map. I thought it was going to screen over the top. Let's go back to that for a second. What you're looking at here is a project actually that I was working on many years ago before getting hired at Shasta College. And you can see the title at the upper left-hand corner, the Bay Area Eco Atlas, and the project was actually about looking at past conditions and current conditions, specifically around San Francisco Bay. San Francisco is located at the end of the peninsula, of course the Golden Gate just to the north of San Francisco, and here we were mapping based on historic maps and historic records the existing tidal wetlands and mudflats around San Francisco. And then in the image on the right, you see the remaining wetlands, tidal wetlands that exist at this time, in addition to those that were remnants from the historical period. Obviously, quite a dramatic shift, and something that mapping can be quite powerful in terms of being able to represent historic changes. Similarly, this is kind of a fun map, historic atlas of San Francisco. This actually shows, you can see that mountainous interior represented a little bit differently here, but this is designed to show the historic creeks and drainages, many of which are completely buried underneath pavement to this day. You can see actually the historic shoreline of San Francisco. This is an area known as Mission Bay. The Giants play right around here. This is the current shoreline. You can see the piers poking out into the bay and how far these piers are from the historic shoreline. Of course, everyone knows about San Francisco's vulnerability to earthquakes. Its famous 1906 quake. It's Loma Prieta earthquake that hit in 1989 south of San Jose. And this particular map is showing the fault lines. So if you're up in the Santa Rosa area, as my sister is, she survived the fires, thankfully. The Rogers Creek Fault creates the biggest hazard. And there are certain types of soils that are going to be more vulnerable than other soils under earthquake conditions. And so this is an example of where mapping can help to address some of the questions that might arise surrounding the hazards of earthquakes. Asset management, I actually grabbed this off of a publication that came in. I'll hold this up for you. This is a, if I can get it, there we go. So this is a company that works closely with ESRI, and actually in the ad that I'm holding up, they advertise, "We know public asset management." And so then I took a screenshot from their website, and they say that CityWorks helps your public works, permitting, and property with affordable, dependable, and proven technologies. So these sort of partner organizations, of course, they would show these very utopian sort of city scenes, but suffice to say, these are big business, big part of the GIS industry. Okay, transportation planning. Some of this is going to be big business and a big part of the San Francisco budget. If you've been down to San Francisco lately, you've seen a new towering building on the kind of area around San Francisco, kind of near the downtown area, and this is part of the new Transbay Transportation Complex, one of the tallest buildings ever built on the West Coast, absolutely massive, towering over the rest of the San Francisco skyline. But then there are more local examples as well. This is simply mapping out where the Muni bus lines are and also the designated bike lanes and bike routes around San Francisco. So this addresses sort of more of a community-based need. There is a increasing amount of bicycle traffic in San Francisco, and so this is a nice example of where we can utilize some of our GIS and mapping capabilities. Mapping of population. This is based on the U.S. Census, and I should mention that I've hyperlinked many of the maps that you see in the presentation. So I particularly like this one from the New York Times. They contracted to pull together a lot of the demographic data, specifically to look at the 2010 census in contrast to the from the census in 2000, and they have it for the entire United States, and you can choose the individual maps. I just happen to choose the Hispanic population, and you can see in the case of San Francisco that the Hispanic concentration is quite concentrated. There are large parts of the city that have very few resident Latinos, but you get down into the Mission District, and that's the historical Latino part of San Francisco, and then there are other areas, including parts of the East Bay, that are going to have significant Latino population. So obviously a lot of potential applications of this knowledge of where different ethnic groups are going to be found. Related to this is wealth or wealth disparity. This is actually a story map that you can highlight to, and they highlight different urban areas. You see New York City, San Francisco, Atlanta, Boston, Washington, and they tell us that the areas in red saw a reduction in their middle class between these time periods. You can see the dominant trend. And then we can dial in and look specifically at San Francisco again. And in this case, they're mapping out wealthier, affluent neighborhoods in blue, and the poorer neighborhoods in, well, the darkest orange being the poorest neighborhoods. This is going to show us some of the areas around the Tenderloin District, if you're familiar with San Francisco at all. Okay, another kind of variant on this is wealth disparity in the Bay Area as a whole, and you see the wealthier areas in blue, the poorer areas in orange, and again you can see some very striking patterns in terms of wealth and poverty in San Francisco, and in this case adjacent Oakland. Actually was just talking at a conference this weekend, a student who actually is a planner now, former geography student, now working planner with the city of Oakland, and talking about this sort of gentrification and how so many of these areas are becoming wealthy and not hospitable to anybody of low income. Okay, this is another article actually fresh out of the fall 2017 ARC News. You can get these online as well as freely sent by a hard copy to your email or to your home mailbox if you're interested in this. And this is ESRI, the big software vendor, and this particular cover story is ArcGIS Hub, a catalyst for creating smart communities, and they call this a framework for government-resident collaboration, which goes beyond, and I've cut off the title, but a little bit of background here, and you can see their diagram where they have initiatives in the center, and they include everything from fighting addiction and homelessness to reducing pedestrian, improving parking, increasing affordable housing. So these are obviously these things that would improve the livability of any particular city, and they're really celebrating this kind of ability to be able to use not only their products in software and industry, but also to be able to pull them into the public sphere. And that's the nature of this particular project. This is quite fresh for me in the sense that I met Ian Durham. He's a new professor at San Francisco State, where I did my master's degree. And his presentation at the Association of Pacific Coast Geographers Conference, which I attended this last weekend, was on citizen science for urban forest management. And he presented on predicting data density and richness of urban forest volunteer geographic information. So this is another VGI application, and he's a really interesting guy who is committed to this idea of citizen science and the ability to gather and collect data from the population. And in this case, what he was doing was actually measuring the degree of response to the VGI effort, where you see these green, dark green areas being the areas of highest response to participation in inputting information, in this case about trees and tree cover. And he did a comparison, Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia. You can see how San Francisco's response, in this case to VGI participation, was much stronger than that in Philadelphia.